kind of just consumed a hell of a lot of football material in those formative years. I ended up doing my university dissertation on football phone-ins, which is a completely spurious topic. That piece of work, which I've never seen again, will have no ripple effect for humanity.
What course was that, Adam? Hello and welcome to Outlines, a podcast about sport, stories and the media. My name is Eoin Connolly and I'm here with the next in what will be a series of conversations with journalists and authors, broadcasters, filmmakers, executives, innovative creators and campaigners about the changing relationship between sport and the stories and communities that build around it. And we did it. Here we are, episode 2. Not sure if that officially qualifies this as a series yet, but it is something. If you're new, great to have you with us. If you caught the first pod on women's football media with Flo Lloyd-Hughes, it's great to have you back. And we've got another really enjoyable chat for you this time. Our guest is Adam Hurrey, the man behind the movement that is Football Cliches, an irreverent and affectionate exploration of the language of football. Adam started Football Cliches as a blog before finding a surprisingly large tribe of like-minded people on what was then Twitter. There have followed 2 books, first Football Cliches and then last year's Extra Time Beckons, Penalties Loom, while the Football Cliches podcast has been a big hit since 2020, inspiring a run of live tours into the bargain. Adam's also a writer and editor at The Athletic, and he should be great company for the next little while. We covered a lot of ground around how vernacular and linguistic tics can form and define communities and the effects of different media and commercial settings on that. And hopefully we've covered it in a way that's a bit funnier and more entertaining than I've made that sound. We talk as well about the development of Football Cliches through a very particular era for the sport and for fandom in online spaces. And we discuss the experience of interviewing a man who was then a future British Prime Minister. That's all to come. Very quick bit of housekeeping first. The plan is to hit the ground running with these early episodes, so listen out for a few more over the next fortnight or so before we settle into a regular weekly schedule after that. We've got some more terrific guests coming up. But first, let's hear from the next of them. Here's Adam Hurrey. Is it a richer time when there's no football happening? And I mean, there's not no football happening. What am I talking about? There's everyone's talking about the Nations League and the Club World Cup. But is it a richer time of year when you've got the kind of transfer jargon and all that sort of thing, or is it the week to week match reports and games and people's performances and all the rest of it that you're discussing? That what's contributing more to the lexicon, do you reckon, at the moment?
That's a really good question. I mean, the action itself probably doesn't feed into our thinking too much, but the action inevitably creates ripples in the news cycle and causes all sorts of other stories to spill out. And that's where we get our kind of gold from. But that doesn't necessarily preclude the kind of close season as much as it is. So the transfer window is incredibly rich for us because that's a very concentrated form of the language of football. Yeah. It's a very intense moment for the language of football because there are so many different ways to describe the incremental stages of a transfer, let alone everything else. And so, yeah, there's an awful lot that goes on in the close season because not only does football never really stop in a physical sense, but the kind of football content mill has to continue grinding as well.
Oh, for sure.
So it's probably been about 5 or 10 years now where the football industry just doesn't have that kind of downtime. There is always something to look forward to, something to react to. And that join has kind of blurred. So we don't really know when one season finishes and when one begins. So in many ways, it's a success of the football media industry to create that illusion that football doesn't stop and to continue filling this space that it's created for itself. But we're very grateful for it now, actually, I have to say.
And it's also like, it's a very rich space where you have this sort of commingling of football conversations with this introduction now, especially in like the last 10 years of journalese, but a very particular kind of journalese where it's like, how do I how do I update someone on something that hasn't really changed? Like someone hasn't checked an email. So, everybody's been in a contractual conversation of some kind or another and doesn't necessarily progress all at once or in proper stages. So you have to say, what was a well-known Italian journalistic presence on the socials said something about initial concrete discussions about a deal the other day.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, absolutely incredible.
There's all this kind of innovation in that way of talking about things. But then you also have like kind of the performance industries and the high performance industries. I mean, not like ballet and and kind of business jargon all coming together in this mix over the 6 weeks of 6 to 10 weeks of the transfer window.
Yeah, transfer speak is an art form, I think. It's an incredible achievement that no one's really sort of paid any massive attention to because we all get caught along in the wind of it all. But yeah, we should really sort of stop and think about just how incremental some of this language is. And in the example you gave there, now it would be easy to claim there's some sort of language barrier thing, and maybe there is an Italian phrase that kind of corresponds to that. But to me, it seems like a natural consequence of, as you say, having to report on something that hasn't really progressed. And so there are so many ways of ticking along a news story for a transfer that really is just an administrative process.
Yeah.
There may be no drama involved whatsoever. It's just the fact that someone might not be available and they haven't managed to sign a form. I mean, that might be the most mundane reason for it. But yeah, there's lots of really boring negotiations go on behind the scenes. But we are somewhat entitled as football fans now that we need to have an update on something. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, we would have allowed 2 weeks to go by without having an update on a transfer. We wouldn't have got that impatient. But it's a very instant gratification scenario now. We need to know day by day what's going on with the transfer. So language has to respond to that. And the people who use the language, that is the correspondents and journalists who, in some cases, survive on the attention of having people hanging on those words, need to kind of conjure up new ways of doing it. So it's a very natural consequence, I think. So I'm not surprised that it's happened.
Yeah, and it's also that move from the dominant form of communication being tabloids, who would, it was their way of kind of keeping football stories going over the summer, to online and digital media and kind of rolling news and all the rest of it. And of course, your colleagues at The Athletic.
Yeah.
The other half, I guess, of the summer, we mentioned it, there is tournament speak. I mean, is that something that's progressed a bit less, maybe?
Yes, I would say so, because the scenarios involved haven't evolved as in the same way that the transfer window has. So we still deal with tournaments in the same way. There's the narrative arc of a typical tournament in the summer will follow the same thing, whether you're an England fan or anybody else. But we are now confronted with the slightly unusual situation of the Club World Cup. And I'm going to think about this a lot in the days leading up to this tournament, about whether we need to treat this Club World Cup in the same way we do a normal World Cup. Does it have the same intrigue? Does it have the same kind of theoretical plot points that a World Cup does? Because I don't know, if I'm looking at, say, Monterrey of Mexico, am I looking at them with the same wonder and curiosity that I might do Mexico at a World Cup, or in World Cups previous? Do they have that same level of glamorous intrigue that a club side does? And I honestly don't think so. So I fear for the tournament slightly. And by the time this podcast out, maybe it will all have come out on the wash, and we might have a different view on it.
Yeah, I think it probably will. Yeah,
but so I want to keep an open mind, because fundamentally, I have no real skin in the game for it to be good or bad. I just want to watch more football. And if it's packaged up by FIFA in an attractive way, will get sucked in. So I will watch it. But unlike a World Cup, and I'm very much a group stage man when it comes to the World Cup, I really like the thick and fast promise of football across all the days. I'll watch all the games, or try to. I feel like I can't make that promise for this one. There will be games, because they're clubs and it feels a little bit more cynical, and their businesses and their operations rather than pure footballing nations, that I'm less inclined to sit and watch through 90 minutes of it, because it doesn't have that heritage, I guess, and that intrigue. So I fear for it a little bit, but we're all very naive about these things often. It might well be that, and FIFA will never want it to be the case, but it might well be that the Club World Cup ends up having cult status, and it takes on this slightly ironic place in our lives. And I think secretly FIFA might settle for that at the moment, at least.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we won't dwell on that because I think it's as we say, it's probably
Sure.
This podcast is probably coming out after it's finished. So just a peek behind the curtain there. Yeah. Let's circle back, to use a jargon from a different setting.
Nice.
To your path through football cliches. I mean, is football jargon, is it something you've always kind of obsessed over a little bit?
I think so. I only hesitate because I don't want to kind of reverse engineer this existence, but I kind of inhaled football videos and football books from a really young age. I was obsessed with the spectacle of it, even though actually watching football at the time live didn't really appeal to me. I found it quite boring to sit through. I was 5-6 years old. The idea of sitting through 90 minutes of a game was really boring. I remember sort of a square of green on the screen thinking, what's the appeal of this? I never quite got my head around it. But when it was packaged up in a kind of historical way in a book or a World Cup video or something like that, I got really sucked in. And I was, at that age, I wasn't obsessed with the language that they used, but I got hung up on the phrases that were used in the individual things that I was watching, and I would repeat them because I was just watching these videos over and over again, and it got ingrained in my brain. And there were sometimes very quirky phrases that were sort of editorialized for that particular moment, not particularly cliches. So yeah, I kind of just consumed a hell of a lot of football material in those formative years. And then probably halfway between that point and now, I ended up doing my university dissertation on football phone-ins, which is a completely spurious topic. Like, has no wider significance. That piece of work, which I've never seen again, will have no ripple effect for humanity.
What course was that, Adam?
It was media studies, which I'm neither ashamed of nor proud of. But I just wanted to go to university.
I was wondering how hard you had to work the shoehorn to get football phone-ins into your degree.
It wasn't too much of a tangent, let's put it that way. So I sat there recording football phone-ins onto minidisc, which gives you a glimpse of the era I was living in at the time. But yeah, at that point, I was really began to be interested in football writing as a potential profession. The idea of maybe working for a football magazine, a completely unnamed football magazine, just a generic football magazine out there. The idea of going into an office and just writing about football all day was just so magical to me. And the slight glimpse of the idea that might be a thing was really fascinating. Although I didn't have the diligence, work ethic, or kind of discipline to get into actual journalism. So that was something of a stumbling block. So it had this kind of vague oasis of an idea. But so it was really at that point that I sort of really cared about the language of football. I was reading a lot more current sort of news reporting. And then the vague concept of football cliches in its many forms was born in from pub conversations on Sunday mornings after games on the Hackney Marshes. So we would go to the pub, we would talk about all sorts of things. The game would be going on the screen, and I would be sort of picking apart the commentary as it was going, which was terrible behaviour now I think about it at the time. But everyone found it really fascinating that I was fascinated in this sort of thing. And I could see in their eyes that they thought, and that I was sort of enlightening them to things that were going under their radar, the sort of words and phrases that we use in football. So that was the first inkling I had that other people might care about this too. So, and then it became a blog, and then things have sort of snowballed gently from there over the last 10 to 15 years. But yeah, it's been a long-term thing for me, but it's sort of manifested itself in slightly different ways.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, I mean, before that sort of more academic piece of your understanding of football language, like, I feel like one of the things that you'd pick up isn't necessarily a forensic understanding of what is and isn't like part of the vernacular for fans or media or whatever. Or sorry, not what is, but what isn't. Like something that sounds wrong when you kind of absorb it in that way, in the same way that a native speaker can pick up on something that sounds wrong in their own language, but can't necessarily explain why it's wrong. They don't necessarily, because they haven't learned the grammar in that way. They've just sort of absorbed it. I mean, was that part of it? Was it kind of hearing things that sounded a bit off? I mean, that's something we'll probably get to when we talk about, the way that the industry uses football speak. But like, what were some of the ways in which you recognize that there are borders around this thing, and there are things that make sense and things that don't?
Well, when football language is used jarringly, say by politicians or something like that, it does jump out more quickly. But I would say I approached it from the other direction. My first obsession with the language of football were the established patterns and behaviours. The things that people were ostensibly using correctly, or as we understood them to be correctly. So I was more obsessed with the consistency of the language of football rather than the outliers and the anomalies. So it's probably a more boring way in, but that was a great grounding, because it was coming from that perspective that maybe you sort of become what I now assume is the world's number one expert in this sort of thing, because nobody else seems to care about it, which is this, if you put the hours into this sort of thing and you really get the lay of the land when it comes to the language of football, then it's a good grounding. And then you can start focusing on the sort of anomalous outliers of this sort of thing. So yeah, doing it that way around was a good grounding in it, and it piques my interest a little bit more.
Yeah, well, it's telling you something that if you're the recognized kind of figure in the space, what that is, we'll kind of unpack as we go.
There should be some competition at some stage, I hope.
But there's like a point at which you realize, right, that other people think about football language this way, and you, I think, are a product of, like, I don't want to call it a golden age, because I think that's a misrepresentation of what the experience was ever like on there. But so the earlier days of Twitter, when you could put something like this out and very quickly find like-minded people or
absolutely,
or people who it resonated with. I mean, at what point did you start thinking, this is something that other people find funny or find curious or what have you?
Well, I feel like it struck a chord at every stage of its life cycle, really. The blog, which I think I started in about 2005, 6, around the sort of time when lots of people had blogs and had them not for attention seeking. And it's strange to look back that content was just being created for people's personal enjoyment back then. It wasn't to get eyeballs. And I started writing because that was the first writing I'd ever done, really, for myself. And I loved writing it because I knew that in my own mind I was nailing the subjects that I wanted to talk about. And to disseminate that blog at that time was really difficult. Twitter didn't really exist then. I had a sort of Facebook network like everybody else does, but no one really sort of cared too much. And it got passed around the office and things like that. And it was really, really gradual take up there, but people started to read it. And I knew at that time it was a really original subject. And it was a time when football writing, both amateur, semi-professional and professional, was exploding. There was lots of different avenues that everyone was trying to explore, tactics, data, all sorts of stuff. And I knew that this was a very specific niche that no one had quite explored. And there'd been a really good book on it called The Football Lexicon. And I was so annoyed that it had come out because I really wished I'd got there first, but I was a decade away from doing that. But I loved writing about it, and that was the key to it all. And that eventually led to the Twitter account when Twitter finally became a thing around 2010-ish. And no question, you call it the golden era. I mean, it is a slightly grand term for it, but absolutely a much more innocent time for what it was essentially attention seeking on Twitter. And the 2014 World Cup, I would say, was probably the first proper social media tournament, the first tournament that you could kind of consume pretty much comprehensively through social media as well as your TV. A real second screen experience. And that was around the time that things kind of took off in that respect, and you could start sort of gathering people into this particular niche. And that was around the same time that the book came out. And a book deal then, and it was a real cynical measure of social media success in the early 2010s, but it is a fairly accurate one. If you could prove on social media that you were getting that sort of attention, then you could probably prove that a book based on that output would do quite well. Now, looking back, that is a really cynical thing, but it didn't feel cynical at the time. I'd never even thought about writing a book. It was just astonishing that it could become a possibility for me. And the process of writing it really exposed that inexperience in the whole process. But the podcast, which came about in 2020, was very much the 2020 style evolutionary stage of this. A podcast in 2020 was like having a big Twitter account in 2010. It was the natural kind of outlet for it. And it's probably been the most sustainable form of the Football Cliches kind of production line since about 2007. I
mean, that's interesting because, like, blogs and Twitter, you can kind of disseminate this stuff relatively steadily if an idea occurs to you, and or you notice something in a broadcast or a report.
Mm.
And then a book has its own natural limit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a podcast has to be like regenerative. So how has that changed the way you approach picking out some of these foibles and these linguistic quirks? Because, has it changed your relationship with it?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it means that the focus has shifted towards more sort of real-time developments, not just in the language of football, because we kind of branched out a bit in terms of our remit quite naturally, but it means that we are a little bit more reactive. Whereas back then I would have focused more on long-term trends and patterns rather than individual things that were happening, and treat cliches as if they were, parts of the football furniture and had been for years. And in many cases, cliches are pretty intransigent. They'll stay for a very long time, even if their literal meaning becomes really obsolete in wider life. So that approach early doors was really sustainable, because I was talking about, I could speak to a multi-generational audience about how the language of football has behaved over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, with a podcast, because it's, this one's going out twice a week, it is essentially following the news cycle a little bit more, and we are a little bit more reactive. So you're focusing more on kind of short-term developments as well as kind of medium-term trends in football, and then again that extra layer of the long-term patterns of the language of football, which is still very much the core of what I try and do, because it's still my ultimate fascination.
Yeah. And I suppose it also, you have different relationships with the community and the audience in each of those settings. Like Twitter is quite two-way. Blogs were two-way, but as you say, on like a slightly smaller scale or a slower moving or niche scale. And then a book is purely transactional. Here's my ideas and please give me your money. And then a podcast is, the community is a really important part, particularly for something like yours where people are submitting stuff.
Absolutely.
Like what's that journey made you think about how language works in the community and how football fans all think about it, I guess?
It's only relatively recently that the podcast reached a kind of critical mass of interest that I was really persuaded that other people would really care about this sort of stuff. And the ethos of the podcast has always been, and everything that came before it has always been, to kind of shine a light on the language of football, which is something we've all taken for granted, but we all consume it every day. It's all come into our eyes and ears. And I knew it wouldn't take a great deal of effort to get people on board with this sort of stuff. But it's got to this point where it's massively fulfilling to have this two-way dynamic going properly for the first time. As you say, the blog didn't reach enough people and didn't really have that capability to have that conversation. Twitter does to an extent, but after a while, you get into a bad habit of essentially broadcasting out and not taking anything back in the other direction. And so, but the podcast, whilst by definition only being a one-way form of communication, I invest a lot of my spare time in kind of engaging with that community. Now, community it's become commodified in our industry, as a kind of social media tool, and it's lost all meaning. I didn't really understand what community building meant until it kind of organically happened for Football Cliches, and it's an incredible family of people, and it's got to the point where it relies on their contributions, on the listener contributions. Now, it's not something I ever envisaged would happen. I thought there would be something I would script entirely myself, or between the two or three of us, and we talk about it. And it might look really lazy to rely on user contributions, but it's great to have that feedback loop going. I read every email, I read every DM on all the platforms, I read every tweet that I get, just in case I might miss out on something that might be absolutely perfect for the podcast. And I don't want to get sort of faux humble about this. I remember what it's like to write into a podcast or write into a website and have something published, and it's an incredible feeling to be recognized in that way. So hopefully we're all getting fulfilled by it in some form, because it makes the podcast so much better. And I love the idea that everyone's joining into this sort of stuff, but all we got to do is curate it at the end of it. And the podcast is just the right size now to make that community kind of maintaining, practical, but also worthwhile. If we were a bigger / more mainstream football podcast, I don't think I would be as motivated to do it, because, why do we need people's interactions on how Burnley are doing this season or whatever, or how Nottingham Forest got on at the weekend? It's almost like we don't need people's opinions on that, but it's great to get that sort of extra perspective on the particular niche that we're talking about. So it's worked out really nicely, but it's not something I've had to kind of manufacture, which is great. Really, the podcast has kind of naturally produced this for itself, which is just wonderful to see, because everyone's been really nice about it, and we've managed to escape tribal kind of fraction, which is, extra special for me.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that we'll probably come back to. But just on the kind of community contributions, I won't out this person.
Okay.
But he'll know who he is, and probably some of our former colleagues will know who it is when they if they hear it being the operative word. But is a part-time commentator, and he in quieter games will basically try and work football cliches activating phrases into his commentary. To see if he gets flagged.
This is a mad influence that we've had. I mean, the one thing I really wanted for this podcast was not to turn into kind of like this kind of inward-looking in-joke generator. There was lots of media when I was growing up that I used to hate doing that. It used to become insanely chatty and not actually have any focus. And I never wanted the podcast to be like that. But having a sprinkling of that weird kind of catchphrase style influence especially amongst commentators, because that's, they're the people we like to keep on board, is really nice. It's really funny. And it's good to know that we've got that influence, because it means the podcast is successful and it's doing its job properly and having that reach. But it is very funny that people are sort of referring back to something that was in the first place referring back to them anyway. Yeah,
but I guess to go back to that instinct about not wanting to become an in-joke, this isn't language you're creating, so it's slightly different from, I don't want to single out Save Chip for people of a certain age, but it's like this was out in the world already, and it's just kind of,
we just repackaged it. So we're not coming up with catchphrases or anything ourselves. That's absolutely, we haven't got the personality to do that. We haven't got that part of the podcast, in our locker, so to speak. So we are just turning a mirror on the language of football, and if those things get associated with us, then that's great. But we didn't invent them, so we don't have to claim ownership of them, so we don't have to get too protective about it either.
Yeah, does it just having that kind of community regenerative aspect to it? Does that make you slightly less concerned that you're just going to run out of observations and things to talk about?
Yes, basically. An average cliches episode is fairly user generated. For want of a better phrase, but we as I said, we try and make sure that we engage with that content directly and pull it apart to give it the best treatment we can, and make sure that we are still producing some original content ourselves. But I'm in a slight state of denial about how much more material there is out there for cliches. Things naturally evolve in football. Language takes a little bit longer, I would say, but when things happen, new stuff tends to spill out. I'll give you a completely random example. When Roman Abramovich took over Chelsea in the early 2000s, there was a huge uproar about what this would do to the landscape of English football, probably fairly presciently, I suppose. And the phrase that kept being used in the media was Chelsea are riding roughshod over English football. I'd never heard that before, but people kept using it. And it took on this kind of really, really niche kind of vogueness, I guess. And so I think we'll always have things to talk about and formats to work those into. But football, I think, changes quicker than I gave it credit for. So we'll always have plenty of new trends to lean on, even if the language of football itself specifically doesn't move that quickly. So, I don't worry about it as much as I used to. And the fact we've got to sort of 400 odd episodes now means there must be a point at which we've reached escape velocity and we're all right.
I mean, this is the thing. So your first book, as you said, came out in 2014, and that was called Football Cliches. Extra time beckons, penalties loom, which I think is that's a very tight observation in and of itself. I think came out last year. What are the differences between those two books, but also how football language has changed in the intervening 10 years?
Two fundamental differences between the books, really. As I mentioned before, when I did the first one, I hadn't done any writing of any substance at all, let alone a book. So I had no idea what I was doing. So in terms of structure, in terms of process, and in terms of how to express myself, I was really struggling. This time, I had 10 years of professional football writing under my belt by that point. So I kind of knew how I wanted to express myself. I'm by no means an accomplished book writer compared to a lot of others, but I knew how I wanted to express this idea a lot more. And also, crucially, I knew that there was a lot more depth to go into in this particular subject. The first one was a gift book, a coffee table book at best, and it was really superficial. This one, I wanted to not only sort of kind of document and categorize this sort of thing, but I really wanted to get stuck into the meaning of why we do it. Not just why it exists, but why we engage with it and why we repeat it and why we consume football in this way. So it was aiming to be a little bit of a more textured, deeper look into the language of football, but while still sort of staying faithful to the original spirit of Football Cliches, which was fairly playful and affectionate. So hopefully I've sort of struck that balance, because I didn't want it to be a kind of dry experience. I'm not an academic when it comes to this particular subject. And I don't care about etymology particularly. I don't care where phrases come from massively. I don't find that particularly interesting because, it just happens. So, but I'm more interested in our current usage of things and why these things persist and why we kind of robotically use stuff. So that was the aim of the book. So I mean, whether people like it more or not, it is definitely a more accomplished piece of work. It bloody well better be, because it was, I've just got a lot more experience and know how I want to express myself now. I'm a lot more confident in what I wanted to say.
Yeah. I mean, two things that will have, I guess, fed into that process of changes in football language over the last 10 years, and then especially going back to when you were doing the blog and, we were getting gold like Park the Bus, I think is from that sort of era,
yes,
and things like that. But a lot of the new lexicon was coming very much from within the game itself, and maybe like an intermingling of different football cultures and ideas and stuff. But since then, we've had social media, and I mean, football Twitter for anybody under the age of 30 is a bewildering experience linguistically. And we've also had a much greater kind of investment in kind of branded content and also the language of business filtering into football and the way football fans talk about their clubs and, staying competitive off the pitch in order to be competitive on the pitch and all that type of stuff. Like, what are some of your observations? Let's take the social media bit of it first, as to how that's moved things on.
I've got no original view on social media. I think everyone has the same kind of consensus on how it's behaved. It's emboldened people for better or worse. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about the democratic kind of success of social media, but it has made people braver in terms of expressing their opinions about their football team and how football should be. And it's the kind of the abusive side of it is well documented. And I'm massively relieved to have avoided much of that. Very privileged position to have not had to endure any of that. But there's another thing which I feel everyone's very afraid to talk about this because football fans are kind of have this enshrined status that you can't criticize them. But there's a pervasive sense of entitlement amongst social media-based football fans about how clubs and the media should serve them. And by which I mean, and obviously there are very legitimate concerns about ticket prices and things like that. All of that is healthy protest and of course should happen and has been happening for 100 years. But the sense of entitlement that I'm talking about is, you should sign this player and your pundit should say this about our team instead of criticizing them. So it's gone insane, that side of things, really. Some people have completely lost their minds in that respect. The concept of having a balanced conversation about their football club just doesn't exist, which is just mad. But otherwise, I think the instincts in social media for football fans are the same as it's always ever been. Blinkered support for your own team, blanket piss-taking of everybody else. And it's followed that rough formula more or less. It's just more intense and a little bit more voluminous. But it's probably the same principle that people were living by in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So in that respect, the spirit of football fandom is still alive. It's just manifests itself in different ways. And then now, of course, to reference your earlier point, which is just that there are so many different ways of producing football content now and so many different sources of it that it's completely proliferated. So the football content bubble is huge. Absolutely colossal. If you'd shown someone what it would be like 20 years ago, they would have just thought it was mad. They wouldn't be able to keep track of it, and it is really hard to keep track of it. But people have sort of settled into their silos, I guess. Football fan coverage is there. Professional broadsheet long read coverage is there. Sort of irreverent outsiders looking in are over here, and then somehow in between all that, match reports are still going, which is just crazy to me, and sort of live real-time reporting, which of course is, you know, the purest form of journalism. So I'm glad it does still exist.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. The way that people speak online, I mean, there is a sharper tone, I guess, a more confrontational tone.
Definitely.
That's crept into...
Right, just indignant, like a really indignant tone.
That's kind of, I mean, I think it has been sort of hothoused a bit, but the character's slightly different from maybe 10 years ago. But there's also, as I think there is in a lot of other aspects of sports and entertainment culture, there's vernacular that's evolved almost completely online. Yeah. Like it's not an online expression. It's not what I guess would have happened a generation ago, which is conversations between friends get spread online. It's these communities have been formed online and they have their own way of speaking. Yeah. I'm thinking of like the sort of Warra Trophy stuff and all that sort of thing that you get if you ever go into the replies on basically any football post anywhere on the internet now.
Right.
Or, you know, expressions that have been imported from other sports or what have you. I mean, how does that make you think about the community that you guys kind of are part of and how that might evolve? Does it make you think that there's a demographic that's eventually going to settle into, that it's basically, or is that already the case, that it's kind of people of all of a certain age and of a certain history in the sport?
Well, I think the kind of core ethos of the podcast means that we're always going to be slightly adjacent to that sort of stuff. And then looking in on it and saying, isn't this ridiculous, rather than immersing ourselves in it particularly. And it may well be a sort of generational thing as well. But I'd also think our audience kind of share that as well. It doesn't feel like we have too many of the kind of real football Twitter fundamentalists, the real kind of head loss kind of community in our listenership. I mean, it feels like that wouldn't be particularly compatible, because then they wouldn't be able to take that step back and look in on it and look how ridiculous it is. Or maybe they do. Maybe a lot of it is, you know, ironic. I'd be happy to give it credit for that as well. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think internet football chat is probably something we haven't explored that much. We're looking at making an episode of it into it soon, just to, you know, essentially inane football content. And I use the word inane quite neutrally there. I just mean football content that exists for almost no reason whatsoever, purely for the sake of it. And you know, trying to suspend a value judgment on it and just say, well, why on earth does this? Why on earth am I watching a recently retired ex-Premier League midfielder blind rank kind of the best players in the world from a golf course for some gambling company's social media? Why has this been created? Other than, you know, pure branding and market forces, but, you know, from a pure content qualitative perspective, why on earth does this exist? And then, of course, yeah, the language spills out of that. So, yeah, the memeification of football is definitely a thing. But you know, and it's easy to kind of dismiss it, but all it is essentially efficient use of language. That's what it is. And language has always developed through efficiency. Football commentary has to be efficient. Newspaper headlines need to be efficient. So online football speak pretty much follows the same thing. People are short on time and they want to express themselves really quickly. Other people realize how effective that is and they start doing it as well. That's really how memes operate, and that's how language operates. So they go kind of hand in hand, but I haven't really looked into it too much, I have to say. I mean, I don't know, maybe half of my brain thinks it's just too superficial, too frivolous, but there's something clearly going on there. So maybe it is worth a look.
Yeah. The other side of it, as we said, is that more commercial content side. And I think that space has moved on a lot from the classic World Cup ads of, you know, four people wearing different shirts, unbranded shirts of different colours, watching a game, cheering at random intervals.
Has. You still see it, which is just crazy to me.
There are organizations and agencies and companies that do really good, really sophisticated work, is what I mean, and have moved way, way, way beyond that. But that stuff still exists. And I guess coming back to the tournament speak thing that we covered at the start, that's a part of the sort of the dressing of major tournaments, is you see more of that stuff because it has to work across like 50 different markets, and
that's exactly the reason,
and be as inoffensive as possible.
Exactly right, because and yeah, the main thrust of it is that it has to appeal to as a broader base of potential consumers as possible, and usually it's for products that have quite general appeal. But the second thing is that it essentially feeds off FIFA speak, and FIFA and to a certain extent UEFA market their tournaments in such a broad way, using such flimsy sentiments like football is for all and things like that, and because of course it has to cross language barriers, which is a more acceptable reason for it. Of course it has to have this universal sentiment, but they are so flimsy. There's never any, I'm not going to say cynicism, because FIFA can't be outwardly cynical like that, but there's no playfulness. There's no even any slight pushing of boundaries with it. It's just the same message every 2 to 4 years. Football is for all. Get your friends around and watch the big tournament together because football unites us all. And yes, okay, all those sentiments are broadly true, or we would want them to be true, because that's what makes football great. But surely there's some sort of football cultural capital that could be tapped into. Everyone likes football and has been watching it for years. There must be some specialist knowledge that could be tapped into to make everyone feel like, okay, yeah, they understand it too, rather than just sort of speaking to people with this rubbish that I can't imagine goes into people's brains, particularly. It can't penetrate people's consciousness enough for the, what they called CPMs or whatever they are for advertisers and stuff. There must be a better way of doing things. There must be a cleverer way of doing this, but they refuse to do it because there's an easier way out.
Yeah, I suppose that's a way into thinking about, who is who the person delivering the message is, or who's leading the conversation, or who's engaging in the conversation. Yeah. And that happens like at every level. Like sponsors talk a slightly different way from how broadcasters talk, and clubs talk a slightly different way from how what now gets called legacy media talks, and fan media talks in a slightly different way again. And then you've got, fan outlets that are very focused on what our club needs to win, and then you have fan outlets that are very focused on the sort of cultural aspect and like the lived experience of being a football fan.
Yeah. It's got to the point now where almost all of those sort of sources that you've just mentioned are guilty of something in terms of corrupting and approximating the football experience in some way, and to the point where you have genericized the football experience so much that actually to the point where it bears no resemblance to the actual product, to the actual thing that exists in real life. So I think we're all kind of guilty of kind of glossing over it and packaging it up in a way that doesn't resemble the actual reality of it. Just football, like I make this argument quite a lot. Like football is just really mundane. There are really mundane aspects to football fandom. Celebrate those. If anything, it doesn't have to be four mates sat on a sofa wearing completely random shirts, having their popcorn, throwing their diet Pepsi into the air when a team has scored, yet they're all celebrating. How can they all be celebrating?
That's a confusing one, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I say this a lot, but I'd love to be a consultant on this sort of stuff. We could make it so much more nuanced. We could get so many better details in there to make it more football literate, but without corrupting this kind of vague commercial message that you want to convey. It would be, I think that's actually my dream job. I think that would be the equivalent of me moving upstairs to like director of football. That's where the real money is. I want to get a massive conglomerate to pay me money to show them how football really should be portrayed. And trust me, it'll be a lot more boring than it looks.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, this may be, the right audience for that. I don't know if there's an audience at all at this point, Adam. But
yeah, get in touch.
Who is there? Anyone you think does that well?
I mean, I feel like if I've laid into it so much, I should have an idea of who has done it well. I guess
you can talk in generalities. I mean,
I guess it works better. Yeah, I mean, I guess the bigger the product, the bigger the campaign, the less likely it is to be true to itself. It's going to have this broad appeal. So FIFA, Coca-Cola, Carlsberg, whatever, they're all going to get it wrong because they have to cover all the bases. So the more local you go, the more niche you go, the more kind of small scale that it becomes, the more likely it is to be accurate, I guess. So yeah, the more you drill down into the media and the fewer people you need to reach, the more likely you are to be telling the truest story, I guess. But yeah, it is strange to me. I mean, before I even thought about football journalism or football writing as a job, when I was at school, I wanted to work in advertising because I thought advertising was great. And in that era, we're talking mid to late 1990s, was an incredible era for advertising. And maybe that's the time they were getting things right, because they were focusing on mundane, tiny details rather than trying to tell this big brand story. And adverts were huge budget, but they were still doing weird, quirky little things. Think of the Tango adverts or the Guinness adverts. These weren't, ramming home this product in a really broad way. They were just they were taking something really artistic and hoping that people would get on board with it. So that's what made me want to get into advertising. But of course, I had no idea how it worked. Didn't look into it any further, and that's how it's worked out.
And I guess in defense of some of these bigger brands, when they're doing smaller stuff or activating at like a level that's closer to those communities. I mean, Coca-Cola, you mentioned, are about to get back into sponsoring the Premier League, I think, and have lots of things around each club. And that's where you might see the really interesting stuff, rather than the sort of the broad glass.
Yeah, but possibly. If you're focusing on a smaller demographic and you haven't had to have that broad appeal, maybe it would make the advertisers' jobs easier. But yeah, maybe I need to. I'll keep my eyes open for it at least.
Yeah. Right. We're extra time beckons.
Yeah.
So we better get into our last couple of questions.
Yeah, I can't stay super long, unfortunately, because I'd be breaking the terms of my contract with my actual job and then letting somebody else down at the same time. So yeah, that's just how many jobs I've got.
Your podcast is split into two strands, and it's interesting to. I just want to pick out a bit on each. You have your main podcast is called The Adjudication Panel, that's a deep cut. I've always enjoyed that. And then you have your kind of regular guest podcast, which is Mesut Harlan Dix. I'm pleased I managed to get that out first time.
I regret the name, quite frankly. It's such a ridiculous name. But when we created it, we never thought the podcast would last more than a year, 2 years. So we never thought it really mattered. Didn't really put much thought into it. But yeah, I had to constantly remind people that it's really ham-fisted corruption of desert island discs.
No, we don't have time to get into 6 different parts of the football vernacular. We've probably got time for 1. Oh, hang on. No, sorry. Let me just walk back on that, because that was the question I was going to ask you second.
No problem.
The question I was going to ask you first. You had Keir Starmer on that podcast about 18 months ago. How did that come about, and what did that kind of make you think about what you've done with this project, I guess?
I mean, I'd love to say that we got him on the podcast because he was an avid listener and just couldn't wait to get involved.
It could be.
And, that would be the dream for most of our sort of guest kind of recruitment, because I'm a terrible networker and I find it very difficult to approach people with this sort of stuff. Luckily, in this case, I didn't have to do any begging at all. It was just a very handily placed colleague who happened to know Starmer's kind of comms kind of chief, essentially. And that's just how it happened. He said, "Do you think you want Keir Starmer on?" I was like, yes, I think I actually would. Yes, I think that would be great. And you don't turn people down like that. And it was a very surreal, stressful experience. I think I'd handle it much better now. The Wi-Fi in Parliament was rubbish. Why would the Wi-Fi in Parliament be rubbish? Like, an insane situation. He didn't have any headphones. He didn't have a microphone. He sounded like he was underwater. And yet this podcast is probably one of the greatest we've ever done, just because it was such a ridiculous situation to have him on the podcast. And that was the main appeal of it. The things he chose were absurd. I think he chose going to football as one of his loves of football. And that's fine. You let him off because he's a very busy, famous man, and it's all right. But yeah, at that point, it was actually January 2022.
Was it as long ago as that?
Every element of podcasting was intimidating to me at that point. My own voice, the equipment, just starting a conversation, moving things on. Every element, every nut and bolt of podcasting I found massively challenging. So it would be great to be able to do that all over again and do it much better. But I'd like to think that we did that podcast in our own style. Like I never want to get, just because they're massively famous, I don't want to get them on and just ask them the same questions they've always been asked before, because that would make for really dull content. So we try and get them into our world as much as we can, and without pushing any buttons, particularly just to try and get them to engage in what I think is still a very accessible subject. And I think we just about managed it, but it took some engineering, that conversation.
I mean, he did stuff like Arsenal Fan TV last year in the Guardian Football podcast. We had so much talk, especially later in 2024, about the podcast election. I mean, you guys, you were the progenitors of the whole thing.
God knows what they thought how it would move the dial with the electorate. We were a very small podcast, but with a very sort of transparent demographic as well. Probably skews younger than me, certainly our broad listener base. So it was worth tapping into for them, I guess. And we all had fun. He looked like he enjoyed it. And that's the main thing. We haven't ever really got onto the kind of gravy train of, branded content and really sort of doing tie-ins and things like that, because that would really dilute the kind of what we're trying to do. So, but I'm not against it. But there are always, everyone's got to scratch everyone's back in that respect. But yeah, it did feel like he was having an element of fun in the conversation. Yeah. So, it was worthwhile.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but the idea that you now, with the podcast environment and everything else, have lots of different settings that a public figure can appear in, and sort of exploring a more niche interest, you create a different side to that personality, or you showcase a different side to that personality, I should say. And maybe that's one of the reasons why podcasts have become what they have in that part of the discourse.
Yeah. I mean, we so easily could have been a podcast that just invites people who sort of like football on and interview them about football and also about their life. Now, I'm not a good enough journalist to grill people and get interesting things out of them in that respect. So we are very immovable in that respect. This is the format. If you listen to the podcast, great. If you like football, fantastic. And if you like this particular subject, even better, come on the podcast. And if you fit in the middle of that Venn diagram, we've got something going on. But if you get two of those three things, then we can just about make it happen. But it will be within our remit and our format. And that's not an arrogant thing. I just think it's more fun to get people slightly out of their comfort zones and talk about football in that way, rather than just say, yeah, my team are rubbish. God, it's been a real journey. I'm such a long-suffering Club X fan or anything like that. Not interested. We could so easily turn into Soccer AM or something like that, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
We have to have that niche, and it's almost non-negotiable. But luckily, no one's ever negotiated their way out of it yet.
Yeah. Going back a step, the question that I've slightly asked out of order, your Mesut Haaland's contribution, what would it be? What would be top of that list? Is something?
Oh wow. Do you know what? Let me bring up the document. Give me a minute. So I got a proper answer for you. I can't pluck this stuff off the top of my head. I have to consult my actual list. Okay. Yeah. I mean, we always, when we get people on the podcast to discuss their footballing fascinations and irritations, it's always great when they pick something really, really granular, something really personal that irritates them, even if it's just for a moment every weekend. I prefer the smaller stuff than big, wider stuff like VAR, because I don't want to hear anyone whinge about VAR anymore. So my classic example, if I was ever to do my own podcast, would be having to watch players, especially players on my own team, having to run up a little slope to take a corner. Old Trafford. Okay. I'm looking at you right here.
Yeah.
I find it both aesthetically displeasing, and I also find it sort of visceral. If I had to do it myself, I think I'd find it massively uncomfortable. And I'm just stunned that in the richest league in the world, at the most elite level of club football, players are still having to run up a little hill at the side of the pitch to take a corner.
It does feel very Sunday League, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's worse than Sunday League. Sunday League doesn't even have that. Like Sunday League is a relatively flat surface. You could run across the whole park if you wanted to take a corner that way. But I'm sure there's drainage reasons. I'm sure there's security reasons. But there is absolutely no reason why a £100 million footballer should be discomforted in that way to take a potentially pivotal corner for their club season. I mean, I'm surprised. Someone hasn't kicked off about the fact that some stadiums have that slope and some don't, and therefore it completely ruins the integrity of the competition.
Yeah, at the same time, I kind of there's a part of that I agree with, but also there's something charming about the idea that you have the same thing as, like, if I were to go and take a corner. Well, I mean, it's a long time since I've taken a corner, but in a Sunday League game, and there was like a manhole cover there or something like that I've got to avoid, or someone's left a load of stuff that I haven't disposed of and taken to the tip, and I've got to go and pluck the ball out of there or something like that. It feels quite equalising having those little quirks, I guess.
Absolutely. Don't get me wrong. I mean, broadly speaking, I am very much against the homogenisation of football. It's really disappointing that You could watch an Asian Champions League game, and it will have essentially all the same furniture as a European Champions League game.
Yeah.
And we should have regional, global quirks in football. And it feels like everything's just been smoothed out across the board, and I'm really disappointed by that. And I wrote a huge long piece for The Athletic during the 2022 World Cup about just how football just looks the same now, and that's ruined it. But the reason it looks the same is because we've all essentially taken part in this process of the pursuit of perfection, trying to make football look as good as possible, or our perception of good looks, a perception of perfect is. And it's smoothed out the whole thing. So there are no quirks, there are no real outliers in football at the top level anymore. And, there are some people who wouldn't know any different. But for anyone who's watched football for 30, 40 years, that kind of texture has been lost a little bit.
Yeah. They're there if you look for them, as your podcast does on a regular basis. 3 quick questions before you go that we're asking all of our guests. I think we covered it a bit at the start, but do you have an origin story or something that kind of kindled your interest in sport?
No particular moment, I would say. I mean, my earliest sporting memory is I was about 7 years old. I was watching Italia 90, and me, my brother, and my parents were on a holiday in North America. We were in USA and Canada. We were stopping off at motels and all sorts along the way. So I remember, or semi-remember, watching England versus Germany in a tiny bar, I think in San Francisco. And at that point, I wasn't an avid live football watcher, so it kind of went over my head a little bit. But I remember the details, the graphics on the TV. I remember Peter Shilton being a 40-year-old footballer and thinking that was astonishing. So yeah, I just the kind of iconography of World Cups in that era was the thing that made me really sort of fall in love with the details of football. So, if I had to pin it down to one thing, it would be watching Italia 90, which is not a massively original origin story for someone getting into football, but it's kind of iconic culturally for a reason. So there we are. Yeah,
and instantly recognisable when you look back in a way that maybe subsequent tournaments have got less and less, to go back to your earlier point.
Yeah.
What's your favourite piece of sports storytelling?
Oh, this was a really good question. First time I've ever confronted this. I never really thought about sports storytelling like that before. I would select Hero, which is the official film of World Cup 1986. It's an incredible piece of filmmaking because football doesn't always look good in a documentary style. Football is filmed like it is for a reason. You capture as much action as you can. And this is what a lot of things that TV adverts get wrong, or Netflix dramas who try and depict football get wrong. They film it from such an absurd angle. But in this sense, it's very intimate, very close up, but it's really rich and really well shot. And just the production standards are incredible. And the soundtrack is sensational, really powerful. I think it's Rick Wakeman doing, he's on the keyboards essentially. Michael Caine does the voiceover. But, all of those things are great, but none of those things would have worked if it wasn't the most unbelievably photogenic World Cup there's ever been. Like Mexico looked really good in 1986. The pitches look great. The kits look great. The hair looks great. Just the standard of, I don't know, video film at that time must have been great, but everything just looks shimmering. It's beautiful. The sun's always out. It's just an incredible looking World Cup. I try and steer clear of nostalgia as much as I can now. I realize, things are in the past for a reason, and I try and look ahead as much as I can. But there are some things about certain points of history of football, and I was only 3 at the time of that World Cup, so I didn't really consume it in its time. It's just wonderful. I'd be fascinated to watch it.
Yeah.
I'm 42. I'd be fascinated to watch it with a 22-year-old and see what they take away from that film, and if Mexico '86 has any effect on them, sort of aesthetically, or if they just go, looks old, looks rubbish. I would be devastated if they just said that.
Yeah, they're fascinating documents. Those old World Cup films, and like to your point,
amazing.
You were so young at the time, but the things that are memories of yours from the mid '80s, I guess, the textures and the things on a very kind of more vivid level. It might tap into something along those lines, but yeah,
exactly right.
Last one, what's a sports story that you'd like to tell, or that you'd love to see somebody else tell?
As you probably know, I am particularly fascinated by obscure, tiny aspects of football, particularly kind of lesser regarded football leagues and nations, where the more interesting kind of texture can be found these days. unnaturally fascinated by football being played in tiny places like the Vatican City, for example, which has its own football league. I'd love to watch a documentary about how they go about their tiny football league. And I'm hugely fascinated, like to an almost unhealthy degree, with how stock football imagery is made for adverts and things like that. I would love to write a piece about how this stuff is made, who all the people involved in making, an absurd sort of bicycle kick happen in a sort of slightly post-apocalyptic background at a stadium that looks far too big to be a football stadium, with a generic football with the black and white panels, and with a goal behind them, so they're kicking it the wrong way, all that sort of stuff. And it's like, who designs this stuff?
Yeah.
But, those two things are quite interesting to me. But fundamentally, I would like to interview Diana Ross about her side of the story, about that penalty she took at the opening ceremony of USA 1994. It would be a great narrative arc to close before the World Cup next year.
I mean, all of those are excellent. I don't think we can top that. Adam, it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, Eoin. I've really enjoyed that.
Thanks very much for your time.
Cheers.
Outlines is an original production from 2640.